I saw this timidity, this media timidity firsthand when I was at MSNBC. They were afraid to frontally challenge these claims coming out of the White House. One reason was the president's popularity was very high, and they were unwilling to polarize and try to fight for the facts and fight for the truth at that time. There was a fear that if they did challenge the White House and have articles and news stories on TV that were telling the public what really were the facts, they were afraid, as always, that they would be accused of liberal media bias, which I learned at some of these outlets is the worst possible thing you could be accused of. So presenting news and information is a very flawed process, and it's not just because humans are flawed. And humans have their personal biases. I think more importantly, it's because institutions have institutional biases and institutional prejudices, and that those institutional biases are the ones that endure, as individual employees might come and go. As I learned when I was at MSNBC, and Phil Donahue and I did not conform to the prevailing institutional bias in support of invading Iraq, that we were out of the door. You know, we were terminated. We were giving our walking papers, but the institutional biases endured. In fact, one of the ways that institutional biases endure is by getting rid of the troublemakers who are insisting on practicing journalism during war while independent, and promoting up the ladder those people that are not going to bother insisting on things like independent journalism. One of the main functions of news is to warn the public about threats. And it's always fascinating to me to analyze what is deemed a big threat in certain media outlets and what isn't. When I go around the country, I've been discussing and debating media coverage of the current U.S. election. And I asked the audience for a show of hands, how many of you can name this minister who's prone to extremist comments by the name of Reverend Jeremiah Wright, and everyone in the room knows. And I say, how many of you have seen comments of this reverend on your TV? And all the hands go up. How many of you have seen comments of this reverend over and over? And the hands go up. And of course, Wright is Obama's former minister. His decades of sermons have been sort of boiled down to a half a dozen comments that are very angry, a couple of them very silly in their belief in conspiracy. But his views are, of course, not the views of Obama, and we know that on a number of issues their views are not only different, they're 180 degrees opposed. For example, on the issue of Israel-Palestine, they're in direct opposition. And every political reporter knows that Obama has been pushing away from this guy since before his presidential campaign was launched, when Obama disinvited Wright from the festivities that were launching the campaign. That was more than 14 months ago. I then asked the audience, how many of you have ever heard of this minister who's prone to extremist comments by the name of Reverend Rod Parsley? And usually no one in the room has heard of Reverend Rod Parsley. He's the guy that refers to Islam as the false religion, and he calls for a prolonged war against Islam. Not fundamentalist extremist, a war against Islam. Islam is over 1 billion people in the world. 5 weeks ago, Parsley endorsed John McCain for president in Ohio, and far from pushing away from Parsley, there was John McCain side by side with Reverend Parsley, who he referred to, again, it's not years ago, he referred to him 5 weeks ago, his spiritual guide. People have not seen that footage on TV. Choices are made in newsrooms, what'll be on TV, what'll be on TV day after day, and what won't. And then I asked people if they've heard of a minister who's prone to extremist comments by the name of Reverend John Hagee. And a few people have heard of his comments against Muslims, against Jews, and especially against the Catholic Church, which Hagee refers to as the great whore, the big cult. When McCain was endorsed by Reverend Hagee 5 weeks ago in Texas, there was McCain side by side. There was a little bit of media coverage of Hagee's anti-Catholic comments, but it was not a lot of coverage. And McCain never rejected the endorsement. He's barely pushed away from Hagee. I've yet to see on national TV McCain being asked about his endorser statement, Reverend Hagee's statement, that Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans because they had a scheduled gay pride parade there. The exact words, Hurricane Katrina was in fact the judgment of God against the city of New Orleans. I bring this up to make a point that what media outlets deem as newsworthy threats, and how important a threat, is a very selective and very subjective thing. And those decisions are made hour after hour in every newsroom in the country. One could argue that Obama had a closer relationship with Wright, and it went back years, than McCain has with Parsley or McCain has with Hagee. But, you know, it was McCain that was calling Parsley his spiritual guide just 5 weeks ago. The disparity in coverage, no matter how you cut it, is quite extraordinary. I think to the big media outlets, a black preacher like Reverend Wright is super scary. But white extremist preachers are not. They've become mainstreamed. You know, their bigotry is almost day to day. It's considered almost acceptable. In mainstream media, where almost all the top executives are white, I believe there's long been this double standard where black candidates are constantly badgered by the mainstream press corps, the political press corps, the Washington press corps, to push away from radical black associates. But white candidates are rarely badgered to push away from associates in the religious right wing. And that goes for even Giuliani being endorsed by Reverend Pat Robertson. It wasn't something where they then peppered Giuliani. How can you accept an endorsement from a guy who said this, that, the other thing, of awful bigotry? It was articles marveling at how Giuliani was broadening his base. The advertising industry, of course, teaches us the importance of repetition. You have to pound home your message over and over. If a dangerous associate of a candidate is focused on over and over in outlets with large audiences, over time that will tend to hurt the candidate with voters. It's a truism. I want to talk a little bit about objectivity and then wind down and involve you. Obviously, objectivity is not a standard that's aspired to in talk radio or on these cable news talking head shows, but it sure is the standard aspired to at nightly network newscasts and mainstream dailies. Some argue that there were these bad old days where we had openly partisan dailies. They would attack their political opponents and political enemies in page one stories, beginning with the first words. They wouldn't have those attacks in the back pages, you know, in the editorial pages. The front page was fair game to just go after their opponents. And they had names like the Springfield Republican and the Arkansas Democrat. And today, mainstream dailies practice supposedly objective journalism where reporters cannot give their own opinions, but they must quote experts, they must quote sources who are allowed to give their analysis, their spin, their opinions.